Hallo und herzlich willkommen zur 28. Folge des All-Day Research Podcast, der euch dabei helfen soll, schnell und effizient in die Welt der Forschung einzusteigen. In der heutigen Ausgabe begrüßen wir Prof. Dr. Patricia Arias Cabarcos. Gemeinsam mit unserem Moderator Marvin Beckmann spricht sie über die verschiedenen Arten der Authentifizierung im Bereich der IT-Sicherheit. All-Day Research Podcast.
Welcome to the next episode of the All-Day Research Podcast. My name is Marvin Beckmann and today's topic is about authentication mechanisms and their usability. I happily greet Professor Dr. Arias Cabarcos. Nice to meet you.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Maybe you can introduce yourself. How did you get to Paderborn? What was your way? Where did you study? And maybe also how did you get in contact with the research field?
Okay, long story, but I will make it short. So I did my education in the first part of my academic career in Spain, where I come from. I'm not a computer scientist. I studied telecommunication engineering, and that was my bachelor. I did it at the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. And then after the bachelor, where I did my thesis on security topics, mostly implementing, I decided to go for a master in the PhD, also in the same university. And then during the PhD, I did a stay in Germany, Next Laboratory. So it was a company, but focused on research. And there I got my first contact with the German landscape. I enjoyed being here. And then I kept coming back for different periods. So, for example, I was, after the PhD, as visiting researcher in TU Darmstadt. Then I came back to Spain. I was assistant professor for a while. I came back to Germany as a Humboldt Research Fellow in Mannheim. Then I went to Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And finally, I landed the position of Professor of IT Security here in Paderborn in 2021, October. So it's pretty fresh.
So it seems like you're quite familiar with Germany already.
Yeah.
Your research field, authentication mechanisms, their usability. It's not like a field everyone is confronted with it, but how do you actually start research in the topic? So there must be some kind of access point to it. What was your point of connection to it in the first place?
So I was mostly doing research on technical aspects of security, so security of protocols, for example, or security in cloud computing, but always from this technical perspective. And at some point, I was thinking I would like to do something that is more connected to what the user needs, what the people using security technology want. And, of course, for example, passwords, which is something that we are faced with every day, came up as a problem that you have to do once and again if you want to use services, digital services, or your smartphone or any type of device or service. And that was my first contact. So wanting to connect the technical part of security with the human part. And in this sense, I work on authentication as one line of research, but the overall topic would be usable security and privacy, as you said. And that means that we design and build and evaluate technology that is not only efficient technically to provide a security protection, but that is also easy to use. And that was my point of contact was wanting to connect with the humans and to do some security that is actually easy for everyone.
Sounds good. We will get into that a little bit more later. We ask every one of our guests some either-or questions.
Okay.
Just from the top of your head, answer what comes to your mind first.
I'm very bad at binary choices, but let's do it.
Beer or wine?
Beer.
Mountains or sea?
Definitely sea.
Hardware or software?
Okay, software.
Theory or practice?
Practice.
Data in the cloud or on your own hard drive?
Okay, that depends on the data. I could say that for very sensitive data, hardware. But then the cloud is practical, and for any other type of data, or if you have the good privacy warranties, then cloud.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Written or oral exam?
So I could say written exams. That's what I'm used to. Also in Spain, we only do written exams. But I think it's not that binary. Like if I had to choose, it would depend on what you want to evaluate, right? And on the context and the situation. So written is very efficient when you have a lot of people. But my ideal form of grading would be project-based. So where the students need to hands-on develop something, and then you can see if they achieve the competences for that course. And they also have to present that orally, and there is some form of written report accompanying this deliverable software or whatever. So that would be my ideal way.
Thanks a lot. How do you define your field of research?
Okay, so I touched a little bit on that before. It could be usable security and privacy, or more broadly, human factors in security and privacy. And the philosophy, the goal behind that is to design, build, and develop security technologies that take the users into account. So you look at how humans behave when dealing with technology, with security technology, and then you adapt the tool, the software you are developing to meet that needs. So not like now where the user has to adapt to the security, but the security should adapt to the user needs. And there are very different types of users. So not only lay users with no expertise at all in technology need usable security, but also experts need usable security. So there's a large use base of people that we need to target.
One of the most common or the most common kind of security measurement will probably remain, at least for now, passwords.
Yeah.
We are already confronted with them in like preschool and school. How bad are passwords actually?
So passwords have drawbacks, and they have also benefits. I will start with the benefits, which are also one of the reasons we didn't get rid of them. They are still there, is because they are very easy to deploy. So if you are a developer and you want to implement an authentication mechanism for your new website, doing password-based authentication is just really, really simple. And from the point of view of the users, there are many pain points. I'm coming to that in a moment. But there is the benefit that you are familiar with it. So, you enter a new website, you have to create an account, and you create the password, and you always know how to do that. And when you have to authenticate and you see the interface, username and password, you know what to expect. So in that sense, we are so familiar. So even if it's bad, that's a good point, right? Now, all the bad things. So the bad things is passwords were created in a context that was technologically very different from where we are now. So in the 60s, and people were not using computers like we do now, that we have more than 100 services. And if we have to create accounts for every service and use passwords for every service, this is where it becomes complex because we have to manage them. So we have to create passwords that comply to the policies specified by the website. We have to remember them. We have to type them, and type them not only in a device with a good screen and a good keyboard, but also in smartphones, which are more complex to type. So, for example, there are studies that prove that if you create a password in a smartphone, it's going to be weaker, just because the layout of the keyboard is more complex to use and you have to switch. Okay, so cognitive burden of having to manage passwords, the complexity of typing them, and then security issues. So having this long lifespan of passwords, also hackers got smarter in attacking password-based systems. And now there are common practices common techniques that they can apply to phish passwords, for example. And then there is this other problem related to cognitive burden. So if we have to memorize so many different passwords, we tend to reuse them. And then if you get phished, for example, or if your password get stolen in some type of attack, then if that password is reused, that would open the door to many different accounts.
Creating such a password is very difficult. So there are many different techniques. For example, if you only search for how can I create myself a password, you find techniques from Bruce Schneier's method, electron methods. All of them follow some kind of principle. For example, finding some kind of sentence, translating the sentence to some phrase. Why is this not really perfect?
One of the main problems with creating passwords is that we are not random machines generators. And we always want to remember the passwords or to have some memorability. And for example, when you create a password that a policy sets some guidelines you should comply to, even if they tell you, for example, use caps, letters, use numbers, use symbols, you could go and create a password that complies, but is still memorable to you. So it doesn't have high entropy, what is called. And because it's predictable, that makes it easier to attack. Now,
something like an exclamation mark at the end.
Exactly. Everybody, if you have to add a symbol, you will do it at the end. There are a lot of studies proving that if you have to do that or to add a number, you will place it always in the same position, right? So that makes it predictable. And if we come back to the generation of the password as a passphrase or as a combination of words, which is one of the common advices. So you choose 4 words or a sentence and you turn that into your password. So that is good as long as you generate these 4 words, for example, randomly. But if you choose a sentence or a set of words that is memorable, like may the force be with you, then again, it's more predictable than something that is completely random. So in that sense, that brings bad aspect to this type of advice.
To overcome this issue, one could use password managers. Password managers take a lot of these problems away because they generate a password randomly. You don't have to generate one yourself. Why are they not commonly used or not more commonly used than they are used at the moment?
I'm very happy that you bring this topic of password managers because it's also part of my research, ongoing research. And I can say that password managers are highly recommended. From a security point of view, as you said, you can have very strong passwords because they are random. You should never know your password. And then they have usability features like they autofill the password for you, making it more easy and quicker, more efficient. But they also have usability problems and human factors problems in the broader sense. So we conducted the studies to see what problems people find in password manager usage and why they don't use password managers. Indeed, this is also part of my ongoing research. And what we see is, for example, that they are either not aware that this kind of tools exist. So if you are not aware, maybe, of course, you wouldn't use it. Another problem is trust. So thinking that everything you have is put into this tool, and not knowing how the tool works. How should I trust this password manager to deal with my most important information, which are the keys to my kingdom, right? And then if you have a password manager and you have accounts that you use across different devices, you need to have this password synchronized. Otherwise, then you couldn't use it when you switch to your smartphone, for example. And what happens, it's, I think, really interesting, is that people use password managers, but not as they should, as it would be expected. So they can have very secure passwords generated with the password generator, but they use their own passwords that they can remember because they fear that if they don't remember their passwords, then they will be locked out in the moment that the password manager doesn't work. So they are using the password manager in an inefficient way. And this is a very important human factor. So how do we convince people that this is secure, that they don't need to really remember the password, that if they use the password manager in that sense, it's totally inefficient? This is one of the topics that we want to further explore. And yeah, one more thing that I can mention is that there is an effort, a high barrier in starting to use the password manager, because you already come with a bag full of passwords. You have 100 accounts maybe, and you have to put them all within the password manager.
I remember that process as well, yes. Yeah.
So this migration needs to be easier. So there are some points where the interface or the support that you give to the user should be much more easier so they don't have this friction.
At which age should I start to use a password manager? As early as possible, or should I wait until I'm like 12 years old? Or
so I have to confess that I'm not working with children or at these ages with regard to password usage and so on. I can guess that up to some point you don't have that many passwords, and you also depend on your parents or your tutor. So maybe a family password manager could be an option at that point. So up to, I don't know, maybe 12 could be a turning point where they are more independent, but I cannot say I don't have this evidence, but I imagine that it would be interesting to use a family password manager up to one point, and then giving more responsibility and independence to the children managing their own passwords, but also knowing that this is a tool that they can use. I know there are some research trying to design password managers also that are targeting this type of audience, because of course the type of software you develop for an adult is not the same as you develop for child. So I know there are research going in that direction, and as soon as there are tools that are usable for these years, I could say that's recommended.
I talked to one of my previous teachers, and one of the most common issues she was confronted with, so she did the informatics for of the computer science for the school, and one of the main issues she was confronted with were them students starting their accounts, logging into their accounts. They forgot the password. After the summer break, an option would be writing down such a password. You can lose it. Someone else can find it. Do you have any idea how it could be done in schools to make it work a little bit better?
Actually, now that you mention it, having schools promoting password managers to students could be a good idea.
I mean, I started to use password managers in my third term, so just at the university, so very late, but I never knew any existed before. I mean, it's just something that came to my mind because I think many schools struggle with this kind of computer science lectures. I mean, password managers are one way of remembering passwords, but passwords are not the only way to, for example, authenticate. I mean, I look at your smartphone and it probably has some kind of touch sensor, touch pattern. What are commonly used or already in practice, practically used methods for authentication?
So we have, as you mentioned, for screen locking smartphones, commonly used fingerprints and patterns to unlock your device. Also very common now with iPhone face recognition. So it's very popular. Then there are other types of authentication mechanisms that you can think of related to tokens. So having some type of physical device like a USB that you plug in and that gets you authenticated, or you can have smart cards and this type of tokens. And these are used in company settings, for example, where they give you this type of keys, and then you can use it for accessing the service that you should be allowed to use. So we have 3 types of mechanisms, right? Something you have, which are this type of tokens. Something you know, that would be secrets, passwords and patterns. And then we have the something you are, which could be biometrics. And in biometrics, there are 2 types, actually. The first type is this more static type of trait, the physiological biometrics, like fingerprint, which are not changing. And then we have behavioral type of biometrics, which would be related to how you do things, which is unique. Like, for example, how you type on a keyboard, or how you walk, or anything that has a behavioral component can be used to identify you. But these are on a more, let's say, developing state. So their penetration in the market is not as common as you see fingerprint sensors in smartphones.
You are also working on other kind of mechanisms. For example, brainwave functions, brainwave authentication mechanisms. I've never heard of that before. What exactly are you working on?
Okay, so brainwave authentication could be a type of biometric where the data that you use to identify the person behind the service, behind the device, is their brain activity. So basically, you read the brain signals of this person, and as they are thinking or looking to something on a screen and reacting to that content, you can determine that these signals belong to this person, and then decide, okay, this is the legitimate user that should be accessing the service. She can get in. And it sounds like a bit science fiction, but brain-computer interfaces, which are these type of devices that allow you to read brain signals and interact with computers, are becoming more and more popular. So we have technology that is available for less than 100 euros. And it's like a headset with some sensors attached that you can wear. And they are already being used like for fitness apps, where you can see if you meditate correctly, or you can see how well you sleep, or you can control even for gaming an avatar with your brain. If you focus, that avatar would move in some specific way, for example. So we thought, okay, in the past, thinking about authenticating with your brain activity was not practical, because you would use a headset with a lot of sensors, medical type of device that takes 1 hour to wear, that needs conductive gel, and then you have to even wash your hair afterwards. So, okay, you are not doing that to access your Gmail. But now that we have this type of headsets, that they are already being used, that they are reasonably priced, and it can be practical. And this is why we started looking into brain-based authentication. So I don't type a password, I'm there, I think I am authenticated.
How do these headsets look?
I would love to have some pictures for you, or images for everybody to see. But if you go in Google, for example, and you search for BCI device, BCI headset, you can see some of the latest in the market. There are from models that can be as discreet as earables, like normal AirPods, right? So you don't even notice that they are sensing electroencephalograph activity. Then there are other models that look like a headset, but they have some sensors attached. And the number of sensors makes the headset more or less weird in a sense. So if you have only one sensor attached in the front, it's very discrete. If you have, we have been trying with a device with 14 sensors, and that you could already say, maybe I'm not wearing this when I'm going out.
It sounds a little scary, to be honest.
Yeah.
So authenticating with something brainwave, with some form of brainwaves, I don't even notice. How secure is it compared to known methods?
Okay, at this point in time, the performance that you can get with consumer electronic devices is not good enough to use in practice. So we need more research and more advances in the sensing technology, in the algorithms, to get to a level where you can have it, for example, in your iPhone. But that's the path that you follow for any other biometric in the past. When fingerprints came at the beginning, it was the same. So at the moment, the security is not yet to the level that it can be implemented as a secure option. And more research is needed. Some areas of research that can be explored are, for example, combining this type of response, brain response, with other behavioral or biosignals, like, for example, eye tracking or heartbeat. So you combine several, you fuse them, and then you get a more accurate picture of the person that is behind. So that would be one of the potential lines. So not only brain, but multi-biometrics, let's say.
These brainwaves obviously have to be sent to some kind of server authenticating myself. For passwords, it's quite easy. They are hashed, and in the best case, nothing about the actual password is leaked. What about brainwaves? Maybe I don't want my brainwaves to be sent to everyone in, let's say, something like a clear message, clear way, because maybe someone can extract something from these brainwaves. How can one assure that this does not happen?
That's a great question. First, I could say that, as you mentioned, passwords should be hashed. And this is not always the case. So this is why we see sometimes these big data breaches with a lot of passwords, because also developers need support to how to store passwords securely. So that would be another part of usable security. And then with biometrics, you cannot do that, as you mentioned. Brain waves are particularly interesting because it's like the most intimate type of information that we have about a human. We don't even know how the brain works. So this is, as you said before, very scary. And this actually got me into looking into privacy. So what are the privacy concerns, not specifically about authentication also, but in general. So I started this work seeing, okay, we can identify persons by brainwaves. For authentication, for a security application, that could be nice because it's a security service. But then, as you mentioned, we can have a service provider that needs to store that in the cloud and do the matching. Normally with biometrics, you do it in a trusted module, like you do with a fingerprint. So that could be local, and you can get that privacy in that sense. This is very important. And if authentication ever gets implemented based on brainwaves, privacy should be a primary concern. And then in the general sense, okay, maybe authentication doesn't get through based on brainwaves, but there are already a lot of applications with a lot of downloads of people that are already sending their brainwaves to services just for fitness or for meditation or for gaming. The moment there is a higher penetration in the market and people have a compelling service they want to use and it's easy, then we will have our brainwaves out there in the wild, like it happened with other
with
data.
Cookies, for example, just the same,
Exactly. And this is super scary. So we need to start, first of all, raising a lot of awareness of this topic before it becomes mainstream. I think we are at a defining point in research where we need to raise awareness so this doesn't become mainstream. We actually did an initial study that we are going to published in our website, and it will be presented in a conference in November for the interested people. And this is about studying what people think, what are their attitudes towards their brain data being collected for different services, for different purposes. And what we saw in our sample of more than 200 participants in the study is that they are reasonably comfortable with sending their brainwaves to researchers, so we can learn more about the brain, for example, or for anything research related. And for medical applications. So if that is going to help me in detecting if I'm going to suffer Alzheimer or a seizure because I have epilepsy, then that's fine. Another type of application was if I can self-monitor myself and learn something. I see how are my cognitive abilities, or if I'm sleeping well, but without having this data being sent to external parties. And when you put marketing in the middle, then nobody agrees to that. That was a very clear boundary that this data shouldn't be available to marketing companies to do targeted advertising based on your brain data. And this is what we learned in the study. On the one hand, that, okay, research purposes, health data is okay, self-monitoring is okay, but other than that, it should be restricted. Consent should be provided, which is also a very challenging aspect, how to ask for consent related to your brain data, because on the one hand, you have the raw signal, and then everything you can infer from that. So you could infer things like if you are an alcoholic or not, if you have, depending on the stimuli you are presented with. And when you measure the brain activity in reaction to something, you can detect things like political orientation or sexual orientation, so a lot of things. And having a way to provide consent for that or to provide protection is very complex. So this is, I think, one of the main research directions to explore after raising awareness that we need protections and that we need fully informed consent. Then we also asked participants about what they think can be derived from the brainwaves. And there we got from people saying nothing to people saying everything to people saying specifics. So also there is a need for more education and understanding of what actually can be taken from that. But it's a nice, I think, starting point and an opener for conversations. There are countries already targeting new neuro rights in their constitutions to protect this form of data. And yeah, I'm very excited to be working on that area.
Is it possible to, not quite finding the correct term, but smooth out information you don't want to share?
From the brain signal? From
the brain signal, for example. So in this case, some sense, erase the parts not necessary for authentication and only leave those parts for authentication in the signal transmitted locally. Mm-hmm. Yes. Something like this possible in any way?
This is a question that I ask myself also in research and that we are trying to explore, but we don't know. The signal is very complex and we don't know how to isolate everything else, because you want just one purpose, right? For example, authentication. But what is the part of the signal that gets you authenticated? And if I remove a lot from the signal, will it be useful? So there is a need to measure utility versus privacy trade-offs. But first, there's also a need to understand everything that can be inferred from the signal. And I have no idea. It's fascinating. I think the correlations in the signal information are going to be too strong to be able to just isolate single, very defined parts. But this is open research.
In your research, do you actually have like brainwaves you're working with, or do you have some kind of participants
Yes.
willingly submitting their brainwaves?
Yeah, that also confirms our study where people said I could share my data with researchers, because we always we run a couple of studies with BCIs and for authentication, because of course we need to collect the data and we need to create a pipeline of machine learning algorithms to do the classification and so on. And when we advertise this type of study, we get volunteers very quickly because people want to try the technology. And they also think that, of course, for research is something that is interesting to do. So we, for example, one of the most important studies that we did was with 52 participants, that they were this brain-computer interface with 14 sensors, and they were looking at some images and text in the screen, and the reactions were used to authenticate them. And yeah, we published the data set because they also gave consent to publish this information, so other researchers, only researchers, could use the data set to keep advancing and try on this open data. And we have several devices at the chair. This is also something that I wanted to mention. So for students that want to do something practical in their master thesis, we have several devices that they can use.
Is 52 a large enough sample size to actually work with
Yeah,
brainwaves?
Great question. So it's the largest sample size on a study conducted with consumer-grade PCI devices by far. So around 5 times other data sets. Typically, these studies were conducted with 10 participants maximum. And then if you see an accuracy that is 100% or 98%, then you see, of course, but you have a very small sample. So this is why we wanted to conduct a study that was bigger in sample size. But still, if you want to be sure of the accuracy of the algorithm that you are evaluating, you need bigger data sets. We're speaking about hundreds minimum, like 300.
Do you think this technology will be more present in our everyday life in the future?
I do think so. I mean, the technology of BCIs, I'm not speaking about authentication in particular, but I think BCIs are going to be popular because they are getting more and more portable, comfortable, accessible in terms of price. As soon as there is a compelling use case, and gaming could be that case, people will start use it more frequently. One other example is, for example, virtual reality. They are also in some of the headsets that are coming to the market. They want to introduce EEG sensors, electroencephalogram sensors.
At which point will you also use them? Is there some kind of bridge that has to be crossed in terms of security for you to actually use it? Because from my perspective, if one works with something a lot and has a lot more knowledge,
yes,
one is much more preserving in the use of it.
More preserving?
Preserving and much more careful in the use. How is it about you? At which point would you use it?
At the point that you can safely use it from a privacy protection standpoint. So that could be also part of my mission, to fight for a more privacy protecting PCI landscape. And at that point, I could also be willing to use PCI. But I'm using it in research, like for piloting and testing. We do it also in our group ourselves, but it's, of course, controlled by us.
So you mentioned that one can write a master thesis, for example, with you.
Yeah.
What are topics one could write about right now? So what are open questions you want master students to work on right now?
I mentioned this study on privacy attitudes, of people regarding neurotechnology, how they accept to share their brain data. Our participants were mainly non-users, but there are a bunch of users out there. So we would like to explore how actually users use the technology, if they take some privacy preserving measures, if they took privacy in consideration, for example, when buying a specific PCI device, or is not important at all. So trying to understand also what early adopters did, so we can put that insights into our more global framework to advise companies, policymakers in what to consider to be privacy respectful. That would be one topic, for example. We are always interested in any type of authentication related topic. So we have virtual reality related topics. For example, how could be the most usable way to authenticate in a virtual reality headset for different type of domains. More about privacy. We are also looking into dark patterns and transparency. Regarding transparency, for example, we want ways to inform users about what information about them is being collected by a specific service, for example, let's say Instagram or Facebook or whatever social network, and give them controllable or actionable means to perform actions on this data, like, for example, removing their data or learning more or send a complaint and things like that. So transparency, PCI, privacy in general, dark patterns, authentication, more on password managers, this topic of children and family and how to use passwords at this level, that's also something that we can offer.
If I, for example, have the idea to also work on these brainwaves, it sounds complicated and it does not sound like someone in his or her master computer science can actually work on this. How much knowledge do I need to actually work on this kind of topic? For example, in the case of, do I actually have to understand what these brainwaves mean, or how do I start to work on this kind of topic?
Yeah, it depends on the type of work that you want to do. If you want to study perceptions about privacy, then you don't need to know a lot about EEG signals and what they mean, but you need to know more about how to conduct user research studies. So there is a set of fundamentals that are useful for any type of study using brainwaves. And this we can provide. We have a book on neuro fundamentals, let's call it, where they explain from the biologic composition and how signals are generated and so on and so forth, to data processing. So if you are going to do an implementation topic, then there you need to know a bit more, because you need to know about machine learning. Then you need to know about signal processing, which is not common, I guess, in computer science, but more on the electrical engineering.
Computer engineering, for example,
also
have to do this, I guess. At least from what I remember.
Yeah. So there could be a more complete knowledge would be required from the basic of the type of signal to signal processing, noise filtering, to machine learning, to then, of course, reporting and benchmarking and so on and so forth.
This podcast also aims at bringing a little bit more light to your kind of research for students actually just at the beginning of their studies. How can I start to work on these kind of topics even at the start of my journey at the university? Is there some kind of way to start in my, let's say, third term?
So knowing security fundamentals, it's an important topic, but at least in computer science, that's a mandatory course. So that's covered. And then if you are going, it depends on what type of topic you want to do. So there are topics more on implementation, but always taking into account the users. And there are more topics on just studying the humans, and then somebody else will take this information and would put it into an implementation. So if you want to do more the human side, then anything related to social science type of studies, so how to conduct surveys or how to conduct interviews, psychology, cognitive science type of knowledge, that could be helpful. And if you want to go more on the side of implementation, besides security, I think that machine learning is one of the most interesting topics nowadays, applied in combination with security and targeting also the human behind, because that can really help in the human-computer interaction.
Maybe second to last, what kind of advice would you give anyone out there in regards to security and usability?
General advice.
Some kind of general advice.
Okay. Have your system always updated. Use a password manager. I cannot go without saying that. Yes, and that would be like the top two. And then if you want more on the privacy side, it depends on your needs. So privacy is a less binary choice. So for example, it depends on if you are an activist, you have different needs than if you are not. So you could use Tor as a browser if you really want a high privacy, but if you don't need that level, then you can use a normal browser or even the Brave browser that is a more privacy-preserving type of browser. And then search for privacy-preserving apps. There are a lot of different apps that are alternatives to the current apps that we use and can provide similar services. And yeah, that would be my main simple piece of advice.
I think with the first two, one actually does a lot of already puts a lot more security in their own life.
Yeah, definitely.
What do you do when you return to your work?
Now?
Today.
I'm correcting exams.
Almost finished or?
Almost finished.
Almost finished. That was the All Day Research Podcast, the podcast of the Institute of Computer Science at the University of Paderborn. I'm Marvin Beckmann, and hopefully we will see or hear each other again next time. See you then.
All Day Research Podcast. Dies ist ein Projekt in Zusammenarbeit des Instituts für Informatik unter der Leitung von Patricia Höfer und dem Fachschaftsrat Mathematik und Informatik der Universität Paderborn. Moderation und Redaktion Marvin Beckmann. Technik und Redaktion Yannick Greve. Sprecherin Sarah Akopian. Ihnen gefällt der All Day Research Podcast? Dann lassen Sie gerne eine Bewertung da.